Hello and welcome to Writers Morning Out, a free gathering of writers of any genre, of any level, sponsored by the North Carolina Writers Network. As you probably heard, the network has changed the venue and schedule of the fall conference because of the flooding in Asheville. The conference will now be a one-day affair on Saturday, November 2nd, held at NC Greensboro, with master classes and a variety of workshops on craft and the business of writing. If you haven't registered already, you can go to the network's website for more information. Today is our semi-annual slush pile event with Ross White and Tracy Crow giving their insights on whether the submitted first pages and poems would pass initial readings. Ross White is the director of Bull City Press, an independent publisher of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, where he hosts the Chatbook, a podcast devoted to chapbooks. He teaches creative writing, podcasting, publishing, and grammar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and is the author of Charm Offensive, winner of the Sexton Prize for Poetry, and 3 chapbooks, Valley of Want, How We Come Upon the Colony, and The Polite Society. Tracy Crow is a literary agent and president of CEO of Millspeak Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated towards supporting and publishing the creative works of military veterans and family members through its imprints, Millspeak Books and Family of Light Books. She is also an author, editor of 6 books, and adjunct teaches at 2 MFA creative writing programs. Stevie Parks has again offered to read the entries. Stevie is a retired clinical psychologist who became both a professional artist and a professional voice actress later in life. She recently completed an audiobook narration training program, as well as a commercial and narration program through an online voiceover school called Such a Voice. She's happy to discuss her services and auto narration. Her contact information, along with Ross's, Tracy's, and the network's website are posted in chat. Ross, would you like to show us or let us hear what your noise is?
Sure. Today I'm using this Mississippi State cowbell.
Wow.
And that is loud. I scared my cat with it earlier.
And Tracy, would you like to show yours?
Well, I'll be using the Purdue Boilermaker train whistle. So we have, what is yours? The cowbell?
Mississippi State.
Mississippi State. Okay.
And for those of you who are not aware, who haven't been to one before, Stevie will read the entries, and Ross and Tracy will make a noise when they would have stopped reading. And of course, if they would not have stopped reading, they won't make a noise. And then they will, and when both of them would have stopped reading, Stevie will stop reading. And then Tracy and Ross will discuss why they would have stopped reading.
Can I hear the cowbell again? I couldn't hear it. I can't hear it.
We can't hear it.
Oh, really? That's not.
No noise at all.
That's what I thought.
This is a silent cowbell?
No, it's pretty loud. That's strange. I wonder if Zoom's getting rid of it somehow.
It may be too loud. Maybe hold it a little away.
No, nothing?
No,
Nothing.
I didn't think that you rung it when you showed it to me first, so I didn't.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, that's odd.
Interesting. I wonder if Zoom has some sort of filter against certain sounds.
They know they have something like the music filter, like for background music.
That's weird. Huh.
I'm going to check my audio settings and see if I can figure out what's going on.
Or you're just going to have to go ding-a-ling-a-ling cowbell.
Right.
Do you have a
You're gonna have to
spoon?
do something like that. That's true.
All right. We're
Maybe
gonna
hit it with a spoon. I don't
we're
know.
gonna try original sound here. Does that help?
No,
No?
that's not sound.
Nothing.
The weirdest thing.
That
So
is super
bizarre.
strange to me.
So you're gonna have to make it sound because not every time we may not always be seeing what there's so many pictures up, they may not see that.
Oh
you're
my
making-
gosh. Well, I'll give a little whoop whoop.
That's
There you go.
definitely heard that.
That was good.
How
Wow, that's
strange.
weird.
All righty.
Okay.
Stevie, would you like to begin?
Okay, I don't see numbers, so just start at the beginning. with
Yeah.
the Nudies
I
at
did that right
Yellowstone.
first.
Is that the first one? Nudies,
Yeah, nudies at
Yellowstone?
Yellowstone.
Okay. Nudies at Yellowstone. It was so dark that I couldn't see the person next to me, but I felt the ripples of their movement as the murmur of our quiet conversation filled the chilled night. It was midnight, shrouding all in black, save for the twinkling stars and occasional streak of a meteor. About 20 of us, mostly couples, are skinny dipping in a steaming, hollowed out basin overlooking the Yellowstone River. Total strangers of various ages, backgrounds, and nationalities share the moment. Aside from one glowing cigarette that bobbed up and down when it had something to say, we lived in a mole's world and knew each other only as sounds, for we dared not feel around. Hey, cut that light! And the two arriving newbies quickly doused their lantern. Applause welled up all around, and the freshmen settled in, trying not to splash. A bottle of Jack Daniels made its rounds, while the heavy aroma of pot quickly overpowered the light smell of sulfur as a joint followed on the heels of Dr. Jack. I lay back, allowing the booze and pot to marinate my imagination, creating brilliant stick figures and personal constellations against the velvet sky. Come on, don't bogart that joint, a high-pitched voice piped up. Her valley accent conjured a girl in her late teens or early 20s. A loud crashing barreled through the woods to our left, squashing all conversation as we huddled in fear. It was early fall and the bears were aggressive as they tried to fatten up for their winter sleep. Valley Girl started a nervous giggle. Shut up, growled an older male voice from across the water. You want to attract the beast?
Ross, do you want me to go ahead and start?
Sure, go for it.
I did not ring in because honestly, how do you stop reading when it says nudies at Yellowstone? Right? So I admit that I kept on reading because I had to know where this piece was going to go. But with that said, a couple of things I want to point out for the writer, and that is the verb tense shifting. You know, I'm sure, yeah, Ross, you caught that too. So, you know, it starts off in past tense. We slip into present tense for a sentence or two here or there. Then it goes back to past tense. So that's one thing just to be aware of. Really be consistent about verb tenses, because that is something that for a literary agent and an editor is going to immediate send out an alert that, you know, there's some issues here. And if it's that quickly up front, then that means the rest of the piece probably is also going to have some issues. And then I'm going to stop and allow Ross to jump in after I say this one thing. And that is, and I stress this to all of my writing students, I call it my pet peeve, but it's something that I want to bring to writers' attention. Starting sentences with it or there, THERE. It becomes a tick after a while. And a lot of times writers aren't aware that they've developed a tick because it's so easy from a stream of conscious place of writing to say it was, there is, there are. And that's coming from a place, that stream of conscious writing. It's not coming from a place of purposeful creative writing, because if we were coming from that place, then we would stop and say, is this the best way I can form this sentence? Surely there's another way other than starting with a nothing pronoun like it or there. So, you know, I just offer that just to throw, because if you notice, I mean, it was pops up at least 3 or 4 times, and that's when it just becomes really noticeable and a tick. So just something I throw out there. It's a pet peeve I have. One of my ticks used to be dashes. I was using dashes to the point where an undergrad professor one time circled them all in red and it looked like this anti-aircraft, flare going across the page. I had no idea I was using dashes constantly until it was pointed out. All right, I'll stop from there. Ross?
Tracy's totally right. That tense shift in the third sentence got me as well. And so I had my guard up, but like Tracy, I was like, I'm dying to get to the nudies at Yellowstone. I mean, that's a title built to sucker us in. And the title like that sometimes proves to be something that's building in the reader's mind before the writer can get to it. And then it can be a letdown. So sometimes a big title like that can be to the detriment of the piece. We just haven't gotten far enough to know in this one. There was one other sentence that I thought, I'm not sure about it, and it's in the second paragraph. A bottle of Jack Daniels made its rounds while the heavy aroma of pot quickly overpowered the light smell of sulfur as a joint followed on the heels of Dr. Jack. There are a lot of prepositional phrases in that one, and I love to see writing that has airtight control of its syntax, that really has purpose and muscularity in every sentence in the prose. That's the poet in me. But that was a sentence where I thought, ooh, I'm about to make my whoop whoop sound or ring my silent bell.
Let me just also offer this for the for the writer to be thinking about. We get up front that it was so dark in the first sentence, and then in the third sentence it begins, it was midnight, but then all the way down to the final paragraph we get, it was early fall. If the writer goes back, there's a way to ground the reader in a time and place where all of that can kind of be set up so that we understand that it's already chilly and early fall and it's dark. So, just kind of keep that in mind instead of like pacing it out so late. It could have just been very seamlessly all put in there in the very beginning so that we keep that reader grounded. We know where they are and what time of year it is. Then when the bears come crashing in, we're there. We're already there. We don't need to be schooled about it, about why they're there. Does that make sense?
And I want to add one last thing as well, and that is I love the movement that happens in this first paragraph. Ripples of their movement, the occasional streak of a meteor, the couples are skinny dipping, the glowing cigarette bobbing up and down. I
Yeah,
love how the
that's
diction
good.
is all connected to movement in that first paragraph, and that bought a lot of patience on my part as a reader.
Yeah, really good points. Okay. Stevie, you want to take us to the next one?
Okay, this
Oh,
one
there
is
she is.
called, oh, I'm here. This one is called The Word of the Lord. Rebecca awakens, the ceiling fan spinning like a dark cyclone above her head in the pre-dawn light. Disturbed by her husband's restlessness, she flings the sheets off her body, slips out of bed, and dresses without rousing Noah nor their 3-year-old twins, Esau and Jacob, when she tiptoes down the hall to the kitchen. She starts the Mr. Coffee machine, one eye on the tumultuous sky just becoming visible behind the palm trees. The coffee maker gurgles, the caffeine-laden aroma tantalizing. Rebecca slides the glass pod out from under the filter and nestles a mug underneath, filling it halfway before replacing the carafe. She sits at the small table wedged between cupboards and the oven at the end of the galley kitchen, savoring the extra strong brew, her gaze focused on the slice of sky still visible from her chair. Though headlines explode with the news of the Category 4 hurricane that has barreled through the Caribbean, Rebecca only knows what her nose, eyes, and ears tell her. Something big is coming. You're up early, Reverend. Rebecca greets Noah when he appears at the doorway. She nicknamed him after he decided to take over the church on Captiva Island 1 year ago. He'd returned from his cousin's wedding on the island, transformed by a call from the Lord. She assumed it would go the way of the other schemes, like the plan to become an insurance agent or the online course for funeral parlor director. But nope, this one stuck. And now they live in a cramped apartment intended for seasonal tourists. Sorry if I bothered you, Noah says. I was getting up anyways. I need to bake something for the nursery snack during the family service. Still working on the sermon?
Ross, did you chime in?
I
Did I hear a
did.
woo? I thought I
Yep.
heard a woo.
That was me at the end of the
Okay.
first
Oh, I'm
paragraph.
sorry, I didn't hear the whoop.
No,
No,
that's
go
okay.
ahead. Go
That's
ahead and
all right.
start.
So, I'm again poet here, not a fiction writer, but a number of my friends who teach fiction often caution folks to not start the story with someone waking up at the very beginning of their day. A story really gains traction when we're starting in the middle of something. And I honestly think I did a whoop whoop at something big is coming. I'll tell you why in a second. But I think this story actually probably starts at You're Up Early, Reverend. Rather than Rebecca awakening. We spent a lot of time on her coffee. Um, there's not much, and again, you know, I do love to see a story that's grounded in like a base reality before anything sort of upsets the average day. But this is almost painfully average to the point of being boring, whereas You're Up Early, Reverend is both, well, we're getting a sense of normal, but we're also getting a sense that we're starting in the middle of something. The other reason I went whoop whoop is we have a sentence that says something that Rebecca only knows what her nose, eyes, and ears tell her. Something big is coming. Nothing that we've heard about her making her coffee tells us that something big is coming. And so the characters experiencing something that the writer's leaving out for the reader, but the writer's including plenty of the mundane for the reader. So there's something that doesn't quite jibe there.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything Ross has gone over and suggested. I kept reading because the title was The Word of the Lord, and far be it from me to stop, until I got to the word. So I just kept going, waiting for the word. But I saw some things that as an agent would have jumped out at me. And so I'll just say some of the things that would have jumped out at me. And that is what he was talking about with all the little details. I remember a grad school professor telling me one time that in my scenes, I would have so many details within, say, a single sentence that they all were weighted the same. It took me years to figure out what he was talking about. And I think I finally understand it. When we're trying to describe a scene, we think that means the camera's panning in, it's panning back. We're seeing her slip the coffee, we're seeing her pour, and we have to tell the reader all these little things. But what's happening there is that when we're telling the reader all these little things and they all basically have the same structure and sound and tone to them, then they all weigh the same and not one of them really sticks out. Does that make sense? And stands out. Where if we had dropped a couple of them, then the movement would have continued a little faster. We would have been a little more focused on whatever it was, the cup or the half filled or the gurgling or perkling or whatever. So that was kind of how I figured out what he was talking about. If you know the great Pinckney Benedict, that's kind of what I took from They All Weigh the Same. And I can identify it better in other people's work than my own. I need other people to point it out to me when I'm doing that same thing again. Am I making sense there? Does everybody understand? So when he's talking about all the little mundane kind of things, it's nice to kind of see that that might be a routine, but we could do that without 4 or 5 of them in the same sentence. Okay. There's a couple of syntax issues that I would have the writer go back and take a look at. And I would just kind of think about flipping, and this is just tiny, flip the order of the dialogue tag with the You're Up Early, Reverend, if this is going to stay in the same place. If the scene isn't, you know, and I don't like opening stories or novels with dialogue. Dennis Lehane is really big on not doing that, and his heart is really honed in on that. But in this setup here, because she's speaking this way, it might have helped if he had appeared in the doorway and then she says this. So just, you know, be thinking about the order of the details and how you as the writer control the pace, you control everything, every detail. So go back and maybe think about what details do I really, really want to get across that's going to make this seem like maybe it was typically a morning, but she knew something was coming. I'll tell you my favorite part of this was the detail about him having become a reverend, she assumed it would go the way of the other schemes. You know, like the plan to become an insurance agent or the online course for funeral parlor director, which caused me to literally laugh out loud. That was gold. That was gold. That told us so much about him, about them, and about maybe where her frame of mind is at this point. Okay. Does that help any? Ross, anything you want to say, refute, piggyback, add?
Ah, that's beautiful.
Okay. And if you have any questions, please, jump in. I realize that you guys can't see, so sometimes it actually hurts when you can't actually see everything the way that we do. So if you have any questions, feel free to, yell.
Shall I go on?
Yeah. Go
Okay.
ahead, Stevie.
Okay, this is poetry. It's called Snail. While walking down a wooded trail, I come across a tiny snail. I marvel at a life so small and wonder, does he think me tall? And what's life like inside a shell? Am I in one? It's hard to tell. While it moves slowly, going somewhere, I move fast, going who knows where. I study it and ponder how our lives exist right here, right now. Could we be alike inside, sharing a light that tends to hide? Perhaps one day we both might see we're much the same, that snail and me.
Thanks, Stevie. Ross, you're the poetry expert.
Well, I cheated a little bit because I was able to see this one on the page, and my eye is trained to 14 lines. You can't get me to stop a sonnet once it's started. I always have to finish them. So what I really enjoyed about this is the regular iambic tetrameter that takes over for the first 6 lines. It's a simple but ponderous setup, where a very common structure. I was taking a walk in nature, I saw a thing, here's what I thought about. So this is a structure that poets have been using for centuries, and we're always glad to see it. I think some of the danger points on this sonnet, one is the rhyme. I love to see a rhyme sonnet, but when I can arrive at the rhyme before the poem arrives at the rhyme, I think that that's a little bit dangerous. And because all of these rhymes are monosyllabic, they tend to be a little bit predictable. I guess inside and somewhere, not monosyllabic, but is predominantly monosyllabic. Um, and so shell and tell was one that I had gotten to. How and now was one that I had gotten to before the poem arrived at those lines. And so that's something to pay attention to. I would also look at line, what is that line? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. While it moves slowly going somewhere. That's the first line that breaks the iambic tetrameter. And when that happens, especially in a sonnet, we're attuned to a moment of huge importance. If we think about, say, Larkin's "This Be the Verse," that moment where, man hands on misery to man, and he moves from iambic to trochaic. Actually, I'm sorry, to a spondaic substitution, then in a little trochaic. Our ears register that as a C change when we've had a really stable and predictable rhythm. So all of a sudden we're listening for a giant difference or a really emphatic moment. But in fact, that's not the key line. That's not the turn of the sonnet. That's not a pivotal moment. In fact, I would argue that "Could We Be Alike Inside" is probably the big moment where you would want to try the trochaic substitution or flip the meter around just a little bit. And so I think that that's a moment worth looking at.
Ah, that was beautiful. I feel like I just sat in this amazing poetry lecture. Thank you. Wow. Wasn't that great?
Yes.
Woo! I was the only thing that I had written down, because you guys have heard me say this before. Poetry is just not my strongest suit here. But the thing that I had written down here is that I found that the most sophisticated part of this was that "could we be alike inside?" And I had suggested right in here, could this be moved up where this is the turn that way? And you've got all the words for what that's called. I forget now, but I felt like that was the moment where we see this writer go like deep for a moment to really kind of reflect. And I would have liked it to be just continue just a little bit more on that in terms of that sophistication. Because that's where it really got me right there. Because it went from the simple, then all of a sudden the very deep complex. That makes sense? But that's all I have on that. Thank you. Thanks, Ross.
Okay. The next one is called Maybe He Needed Killing. It was a celebration, all right. 8 members of the Wardsville Women's Book Club were gathered on Mary Lynn Holcomb's large patio, laughing and sipping margaritas, reminiscing about their 20 years as a group and trying to ignore Mary Lynn's husband, who had grabbed the special extra large margarita he was offered and then stormed off into the den, yelling at them to keep their stupid girl talk down so he could watch his game in peace. At first, was that a sound? Oh, no. At first, whenever there was general laughter on the patio, there would be a loud slamming commotion and curse from the den. Now, however, an hour later, it was quiet. Norma and Patty excused themselves to go make another pitcher of drinks and were whispering in the kitchen while keeping an eye on the group outside. Go check on him, quick, Patty said. The man scares the hell out of me. You do it, Norma said, shivering. Hell, Norma, I'm just a chemist. You're the nurse. I couldn't find a pulse if it had a press here sign on it. Now hurry before Mary Lynn decides to get all hostessy and comes in here to help us. Patty sighed deeply. All right, but if he hits me, come running. She edged around the corner to the closed den door and carefully, slowly turned the doorknob, not wanting to make the least bit of noise. Opening the door a crack, she peeked in. John Holcomb was sprawled out on the sofa, mouth open, eyes closed, not moving. His margarita glass was empty and tipped over on the floor near his dangling arm. Norma whispered, John, are you asleep? Getting no answer, she swiftly moved over to the sofa. It looks like it's cut off. There's a comma.
Oh, okay. I'll go ahead and start, Ross, if that's okay on this one. Again, you guys with these killer, no pun intended, titles that I had to keep reading because I had to know like what was going to happen here. And I'm really intrigued whether this group of women, or at least these two, had something to do with what's maybe the killing. I don't know. I'm going to say this for the writer. And so while I'm intrigued, I'm also concerned early on because of the language, which was, again, it was a celebration. Then we have, there was, there, we have a lot of that. And there's so much good stuff that's being set up in that opening paragraph that I would have the writer go back and look at how to restructure a couple of those sentences to get rid of these phrases that are there were, there was, it was, and just make it as solid and as more and as purposefully creative as possible, because this has the potential to be a really cool opening scene. There's a lot going on. At first I thought, should this sentence be broken up? I'm not really necessarily saying that it should be broken up because there's an awful lot going on and it does so kind of seamlessly, but I think it could be done a little smoother. That would make an agent feel as if she's can relax and she's in the hands of a master storyteller and not thinking, oh, how much more am I going to have to really edit and develop along the way of this if this is the opening paragraph with some of this language of it was and there are's and there was's in there. Hope that makes sense.
So I was all in on this title and could not wait to hear more. But one thing that I noticed was when I read fiction, I really want characters to live in all of the complexity that every human being carries around with them. I mean, I think we're all a walking mass of contradictions and confusions. And when I looked at the title and then in the second sentence, Mary Lynn's husband takes a drink, storms to the den, yells at them to keep their stupid girl talk down, and then just watches the game, it was like, oh no, he definitely needed killing. The story doesn't feel any conflict about that, even if a character is going to feel some conflict about that. And I think that this might be a story that would have benefited from letting its premise breathe a little bit in the first couple of paragraphs. Let's get to know the women in the book club a little bit, maybe before we introduce the obvious murder victim. Maybe even let's see a little bit of complexity in Mary Lynn's relationship with her husband, because he might be a brute, he might be a misanthrope. But they've been a group for 20 years and he's been there the whole time. And so there probably needs to be some sort of empathy for how that has happened, even if Mary Lynn is a long-suffering wife. But the story doesn't necessarily approach its characters, I think, with as much empathy as it might, given that it's gonna need to create the stakes of someone losing their life, which should be a big deal for every reader. But as he's still sort of a character, we're like, yeah, okay, cool, he's gone. Let's get to the mystery. So he serves it almost as a prop in some ways.
Mhm. Interesting. That's good. Okay,
Okay.
go ahead, Stevie.
Okay. This is fiction. Madrid dark on your knees. Midnight on a murky back street in Chueca. Screams. De rodillas. Shouts and banging. Gay bashers? Terrorists? I wince and really hope I can quickly find that new club and scamper to it. Gotta be somewhere around here. De rodillas, puta. On your knees, whore. Could be recreational. Then I peek around the corner and spot a short female with a long stick raised above a human lump on the pavement. Two scrawny guys flank and watch the pixie hair fury shrieking, "Sal de aquí! Get out of here!" Whoa, my eyes can smell alcohol frenzy as she stomps and crushes stuff on the ground. Ugh, what would Lonely Planet advise? Gringos stay out of it, make like a conejo, and hop into a darker alley? Oh, and then back in the side corner, I see a tiny older Asian woman sitting behind a folding stand. She's selling cigs, gum, cookies, and maybe condoms. Her eyes plead fear and please buy something. So I finger wave and calmly whisper, "Hola," just so she'll know I'm not with the raging bull. And then I realize that the lump attack victim likely is another vendor who couldn't escape. Another crash, wood splintering. Now we both jump. De rodillas getting close. The vendor grabs her display cloth's four corners to sack up her stuff, snaps her table shut, then shuffle runs down the hill out of sight. I start to panic, knowing that as a foreigner here, I'd likely get no mercy either.
Whoop, whoop.
But I finally spot a dim lit doorway that's got to be the club and dart for what I hope is friendly safety. Maybe ask the guard if there's something they can do.
First, can we give it up for Stevie and the wonderful Spanish accent? Wow, that was awesome. Go ahead, Ross.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that we like to see characters who are sort of grounded in their base reality before the sort of upsetting event happens. And while we like to start in the middle of some kind of action that indicates what that might be, this is a story that before I know anything about the narrator at all, they're embroiled in this really difficult scene. And so I don't necessarily know what's at stake for them. I get a little bit of that with the questions that they ask themselves in the first paragraph about what is it that I'm hearing. But then they kind of immediately say, well, I hope I can get away. And so I don't really get a sense of like, who they are, what exactly is at stake for them being on this murky back street in this moment, and what it might mean for them that they're stumbling across this scene. And so that's already sort of a confusion in my mind. I I did think that some of the description here was excellent. But I also kind of wondered tonally about the vendor behind the folding stand, and she's both fearful, but she's thinking, come and buy something, and so she seems kind of not totally affected by the scene, but a little bit affected by the scene. And so I'm really starting to have trouble figuring out, okay, so what are the stakes for her in this moment? And I kind of found myself unable to locate how much danger I ought to feel in this moment, and where my best empathy is supposed to lie, because I don't really know anybody yet.
Yeah, I concur 100%. I have a little bit of an advantage in that I had read this before because if I recall, this was submitted for Flash. And, as Flash, it's a slightly different feel format, that we might follow. But the fact that we really don't know anything about this narrator and it's in a first person, then it really does kind of cause us some pause all the way through. Like we're not invested fully. We're not really, because we don't really know who this person is and what is at stake, exactly as Ross put it. Although the descriptions are really, really good, I would suggest putting the English version of what the Spanish is, maybe in parentheses, to kind of set it off, because I didn't know if somebody was continuing to talk and that was in English. And then I realized, no, wait a minute, that must be the English version. So that could help the reader figure out that, okay, that's the Spanish. And then the narrator is interpreting it for us or for the narrator, him or herself. But 100% agree with Ross that, the opening, we need to know who we are grounded with. And we don't find out who that really is until we get almost to the end to find out that this is a tourist. So just, there's so much good in this. So just keep playing around with it until you find just the right degree of parsing out and the right order of parsing out the details, because it's close. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay, Stevie.
Okay, fiction, the importance of hair. Marge, thanks for joining me. I think you'll enjoy the food here at Zong's Dumpling House. Their barbecue pork roll is the best in town. Oh, yeah, sure. And thank you, Ralph. Not sure why you invited me. I'm sure glad you did. I've seen you around the office, of course. You're the new lawyer, right? Yes,
Keep going.
but only
You can keep going.
yes, but only on contract to help with the problem at your company. I like problem solving and I like meeting new people like you, Marge. I've asked around about you and I'm glad for this chance to get to know you better. Oh, sure, it'll be nice to get to know you too. I'm glad. I like your hair, Marge. How long is it? Pretty long. I'd like it shorter, styled. It's easier having it long. I can pull it back into a banana clip like I've done today and be done with it. Why'd you ask? You like long hair on women? I knew someone with long hair some years back. I think of her when I see long hair. An old-
I'll stop there.
Okay. That's it.
Tracy, I think you're up first this time.
Yeah. And I always hate when you guys don't get to hear the rest of everything, just so that you kind of know. But I'll just say, this does not have the standard punctuation, which was fine because I figured out early on. Sorry, my dog's scratching over here. I figured out early on that we're in dialogue here. But just so that you know, since you can't see this, but I'm a real stickler on dialogue. I mean, dialogue's first of all, I have no idea who these people are. And other than Marge and Ralph. So I'm not grounded and I'm not really kind of like invested emotionally yet. Like, do I need to care about these two people and why and what's really at stake for this date or dinner? And then the dialogue itself is very mundane, or it's very street conversationally. And one of the things in writing that we really stress with dialogue is that dialogue needs to be at least twofold. It needs to be telling us something character driven, character wise, about the person speaking, at the same time moving forward with the narrative. And in this, sure, hi, thank you, blah, 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 that kind of thing that we would almost say that you don't do, like when you're answering a phone call in a story, like, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. We don't just cut that stuff out and get right to us, because if this is going to open like this with two people on a date with some really weird stuff going on about hair length, then we need to see some really punchy dialogue, where they're giving it kind of like back to each other, or something needs to be revealing itself with every, not just someone has it like, the length of asking a question about the length of your hair. I mean, he's looking at her hair or whatever. I hope that makes sense. Ross, you want to clean that up for me some? I haven't eaten today, so my sugar level's plummeting, and I'm like, woo, I really need to eat these crackers.
Yeah,
Go
no,
ahead.
I found myself really wanting to know a little bit more about who these two people were, and I feel like Ralph is revealing some things about himself in the dialogue. But some of what he's revealing is that he's pretty creepy, with lines like, "I've asked around about you, and I'm glad for this chance to get to know you better. I like your hair. How long is it?" Um, and so, this is somebody who, I think would make many people uncomfortable, and Marge's answers don't seem to reflect any of that discomfort, and therefore the story can't reflect any potential discomfort that may be there. And so I kind of wondered if perhaps the dialogue only format for this story was getting in the way of some of what the author wanted to tell us about these characters very quickly, very early on. And in so doing, might help us quickly gain some stakes for the story. I'm always kind of thinking when I read a story, uh, which character do I feel like the author is pointing me towards plugging into? Where does the author want my empathy? And in great stories, the author wants my empathy with a number of characters, not just one. A lot of times there are two characters who have conflicting value sets or conflicting desires, and I feel for both of them, and that's sort of the complexity of the piece. Whereas in this one, I feel like maybe the story is kind of pointing towards Marge, just because Ralph seems a little skeevy, and I don't quite know why, but because I don't know anything about her and because my senses haven't been activated, I'm thinking through that problem, but I'm not yet feeling anything. And so, one other thing that this story might want to do is try to activate those five senses very quickly so that we find ourselves in our bodies and therefore in that place where we're extending feeling into the story.
Exactly. In this case, I feel like if the intent was to show us this story through the device of this back and forth dialogue, then this device is actually getting in the way, And so anytime devices come across too gimmicky, then they better really, really work well. Otherwise it does come across too gimmicky and to the point where the device itself is getting in the way of what could be a really, really interesting story if, as Ross said, the other senses were actually activated.
It's,
Clear.
it seems to me like, and I think at least 3 occasions today, that what you're saying is that people aren't setting the scene right in the beginning. There's at least 3 times. Am I right? Because in some
Openings
cases, aren't they,
openings are hard. Openings are hard. And this is why, writers will spend forever getting those first 25 to 50 pages right, and then sometimes it falls apart afterward because they've heard so often about working on those openings to attract an agent or to attract an editor, and they can spend forever getting the right opening until they finally feel with enough feedback they have it. But you're right, these openings are hard, and I would say read, read, read. And if you find an example that you are in love with, then emulate it. I mean, this is what the great writers used to do before MFA and writing programs and workshops. They would emulate one another. They would I mean, I had a grad school professor one time, I think I've told you the story, who said journalism had ruined me as a writer because I didn't know how to write any sentence longer than 12 to 16 words. And I didn't have a quarter word in me. I didn't have anything over a dime left. And so she said, your assignment all summer is to go home and model Proust, which, if you know anything about Proust, takes you in one sentence across 4 or 5 pages, right, Louise? So, I did that. I actually modeled it, and it broke me of that 12 to 14 word sentence. But find an opening that you absolutely love, that works, and emulate it. Practice on it with your own material, substituting an article for an article, a verb for your verb, a noun for your noun, an adjective, God forbid, for your adjective. I mean, find those those paragraphs that you love, and then analyze, like, what do I admire about this paragraph? What is it working, and why is it hitting me the way that it is? And then try emulating a few of those until you find your way in, and then you find your own way and style through the rest of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I want to say that I feel like by the end of that page, that you each have raised the questions or some missing things that never came out enough early on to make you comfortable what happens at the end, right? I know you're saying emulate a thing, but that's what I'm picking up seems to be missing to you. Am I right?
There's this feeling that as for me as an agent, when I'm reading, if I'm not having to stop every other sentence and go, error, wrong, syntax problem, like, where are we? Something emotive is missing. If I have to do that throughout the whole first paragraph, then I'm not going to make it much past that first page. Because if the first paragraph is already that way, then I can assume the rest of the story is going to fall apart or going to need so much help that my time just does not allow that at this point. So yourself, when you're doing a lot of reading, that when you open up a book and you're reading an opening paragraph, you're probably not stopping every other phrase or sentence thinking, no, that's wrong, that's an error, that's not emotive enough. You're relaxed, you're actually sitting there and you're swept into a story and you're moving forward. And see, with a lot of these, with some of these, they need extra drafts, they need some more playing around. That's all. They need to be chiseled a little bit more into more artful prose, so that some of those elements show back up, so that the reader can actually just relax and read the story without the errors jumping up as if we're looking at them with 3D glasses.
I think
Cool.
Does that make sense?
one way to also think of this is that every story teaches its reader in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs how that story wishes to be read. And when we are creating a whole world from scratch, we have to teach the reader what kind of world we're in and where the reader fits into that world. And sometimes sci-fi does this beautifully, maybe even better than any other genre, because we immediately know, this is not the reality I recognize. So I have to pay attention to the physics. I have to pay attention to the ways in which relationships may look human and the ways in which they may not. But we're not reading sci-fi today. We're hearing a lot of really strong literary stories, but those literary stories still have to teach us, well, okay, how is this to be read? And is this a story that wants to focus on character? Is this a story that wants to privilege plot? Is this a story that wants to privilege language and attention to the moment? And each of those stories sort of has its own advantages and disadvantages. But I think there's a danger sometimes of a story that privileges plot over a story that privileges character or full immersion in the world, because then we sort of downshift from reading for pleasure to reading for information. And so when we don't have like a strong grounding in the world or a strong grounding in what is the reality that the reader is entering, we downshift into that, I'm going to read for information only, and we lose some of the artfulness in those moments.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's good stuff.
Okay, Stevie.
Little Miss Tiny Beauty Pageant. Jules squinted into her mirror, stuck the 14-karat gold post of her tiny diamond earring into its hole, and twirled on the back keeper. At least Mama gave me a first name I could live with, she thought. Her name was like a personal theme for her life. For the last 7 years after she got her ears pierced for her 16th birthday at Belk Leggett's The Easley Mall, she always wore the same jewel. Little tiny diamonds, little pearls, gems of every color to go with her different clothes. Jade and ruby chips of blue agate and opals. And she had all the birthday stones, garnet, sapphire, and aquamarine, although only one of them was actually hers. She even named her little girl once she came along after one kind of old and precious jewel, amber, that she remembered from biology class her last year in school. It was a hard yellow sap left over from prehistoric times. That had to be worth something. She hadn't found any amber jewelry suitable for a girl yet, but she was looking. Amber had much dignity as a name. Amber Marie. The Marie was French and ladylike, and that was what she hoped for her little girl. She didn't want to make a mistake and give her daughter a dumb middle name like Mabel, which Mama had named her after great-grandma. It didn't have any dignity and sounded old. Jewel never used it. She didn't want to talk like Mama either, who sounded country. Mama, if the truth be told, didn't have a whole lot of taste, which deficiency in her own self Jewel had been trying to root out ever since she'd figured out it was her problem too.
I kept reading because I was curious and wanted to see where this was going to go. But I was aware that I was getting lost. At first, I'm thinking that this is a young person. And then I realized that there's the 7 years. And then I realized she's had a daughter. And I was getting confused, like, okay, wait a minute, I'm not settled. I'm not settled in who this really is yet. And I'm having to keep track of time and when she's in school and when she's not. And she's got a daughter here. And it was just a little bit all over the place, and I would have been a little hesitant to flip the page to a page 2 at that point, unless there was something that really grabbed me at the top of page 2. Ross?
The syntax of the last sentence had me sort of tangled in knots. And so I will say that might have been a moment where I might have been like, oh, wait, I'm out of the story. But I loved the details early on. I loved that it was the Belks at the Easley Mall, because I think that's deeply locating and highly specific. The lists of all the jewels that Jewel carries around with her, sort of great. And then she's the story sort of establishing some tension between what Jewel wants for her daughter and what's being given to her through the name. And so I was really deeply interested in this one. And I'm with Tracy. I think cleaning up the language and syntax here a little bit could be helpful. But I was really moved by this character and can't wait to see what complicates her life in future pages.
And in this one, it could have been that I got mixed up because of the title. Once again, that title thing, because it's got Little Miss Tiny Beauty Pageant. And then we start off with Jewel in the mirror, and I'm thinking it's this little girl putting on her earrings. So, again, it's those details that kind of ground us a little bit more faster. When we have a title like that, that's going to kind of think about how that title might have some readers beginning, where they might begin mentally, emotionally, and then when they get pulled back out of it. So that could have just been my read of it, but it started to play with my mind, like, wait a minute, where am I? What do I need to hold on to? But I do love that we're already picking up some of this complicated relationship with the mother and the daughter, the older mother, mama, or whatever. That named her middle name, Mabel. So yeah, that was good. Okay. Anything else, Ross, that you wanted to say?
No, I think we're ready for the next one.
Okay, this is fiction. Wagons, horses, and autos zigzagged down Gow Street, and frenetic energy swirled in their wakes. Mary Kelly shuffled along the cobblestone and turned down Ivy Street. A heat wave had descended on San Francisco that evening of April 17, 1906, drawing people out of their homes to frolic in the streets. Frustration churned in Mary's belly as she navigated the city's gauntlet. When Mary reached her building, she stopped to catch her breath. Valley fever had all but destroyed her lungs, and she summoned what energy she had left after cleaning at St. Ignatius Church to climb the stairs. She looked up and saw her son's silhouette in the open window. He peeked his head out and waved, "Mama!" Mary filled her lungs and swallowed the threat of a coughing fit. "Hello, my love. I'll be up soon." She feigned a smile. At the top of the stairs, she heard footsteps race across the hardwood floor. The door swung open, and Teresa and Ignatius poured out and latched onto her. Mary stumbled backward. William limped to the door, dragging his left foot behind him. The swish sounded like the broom at church. "Leave your mother be," he said. "Hello, my loves." Mary hugged her children. They clung to her skirt, and she felt the strain of their weight as she pulled them inside. The stagnant heat of the apartment magnified the smell of salt pork, potatoes, and rosemary in the narrow hallway. "Supper is on the stove," William said. "I'll make you a plate." Mary shook her head. "I have to be at church early tomorrow morning."
I loved so much about this. Go ahead, Ross.
I agreed. There's so much great detail that puts me in this world immediately. Um, I feel like I've got a sense of some of Mary's complicated existence by the fact that her lungs are destroyed and she's still, having to walk up the stairs and care for the kids. I loved that the author has engaged all of my senses. There's smell, there's touch, there's taste, and so much good stuff happening that I feel I'm just like I'm in this world. I'm also really excited about the idea that her son is named after Saint Ignatius, the church where she cleans, and so I feel like that's going to be building towards something. There's just a lot to like here. My only question is that evening of April 17th, 1906, when you give me a hard and fast date in the first paragraph, I'm like, historical fiction. Am I supposed to know that date? Is there an earthquake? So I almost like had the temptation to bolt out of here and check Wikipedia real quick before I kept going. But I was in it. I was totally in it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I could probably talk about this piece for like 30 minutes, what I like about it. But I will say that throwing that date in there like that, just kind of keep in mind that it does pull the reader out for a second, where the reader has to wonder like the significance of that. And since nothing about leading up to that tells us, then just be aware that if this is leading to something historical, in a particular date, do we really need to know the actual date right then? Can it somehow be led up to? I did, that first sentence kind of threw me just a little bit with the frenetic energy swirled in their wakes. So, I mean, that could have been maybe just a little bit tweaked a little bit, but I tell you what, I loved so much of this. One of the things, like Ross said, with all the sensory details that are brought in here, but also the fact that William drags his left foot behind him. The swish sounded like the broom at church. And I was like, whoa! I mean, that's right. I mean, it was like, oh my God, I love that detail. So now when I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, I'm in the hands of a master storyteller here. I can relax. Let's go. Where are we going? Where is this taking off to go? So I don't know if you guys could hear it and hear some of the difference and hear the setup with all the details as it's being read aloud, the way that we have seen and read it. But there's just so much going right in this. So much. Even I will even don't jack your thought forever. Even the placement of the dialogue tags, I thought was so well done and thought purposefully, thought out. And those things are important. I mean, we don't, right nowadays, the contemporary version of dialogue tags is just to say, he said, whatever, use the word said, and that's fine. But the placement of it, do they come before the dialogue? Do they come after the dialogue? All of those things matter because the writer controls the pacing of the read and the delivery of the details. And so you want to keep in mind, what details do I need to set up first so that which ones are going to hold and resonate longer with my reader? And always the ones that come at the end of the sentence are the ones that are going to resonate more with the reader. Does that make sense?
Tracy, could you give one example of what you just described, please? One example from the story, please.
Yeah. So you mean about the placement of like a dialogue tag? Okay. So for example, I'll just start off with, she sees the sun's silhouette in the open window. He peeked his head It could have been that she just jumped into "Mama," he said, peeking out the window. But instead, she's purposefully allowed you to see the silhouette. Then she allows you to, oh, I say she, I don't know who wrote this. I'm just using the pronoun she. And then she has his head peek out so that you see that next and waves. And then we hear the mama. The other one is she allows us to see William, who we don't really know yet, but we can assume limping to the door, dragging his left foot behind him. The swish sounded like the broom at church. "Leave your mother be," he said. So we get this character analysis, basically this little character description of who this person is, and obviously limping and obviously caring for the children and creating this dinner, but we get the dialogue afterward. So, you know, it's just, sometimes it's just so simple as the placement of these details allows you to see that the writer is in control of how the details are to be received and absorbed. And that's really masterfully done here. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Love. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I will say this. The only thing I got kind of hung up on was that last line, you know, "Supper's on the stove, I'll make you a plate." And she does say, "I have to be at the church early tomorrow morning." So obviously the word count had to stop there, but I thought, what does one have to do with the other? You know, like, can't eat supper because you have to be at church the next morning. But again, I think that's just because the word count had to shut it off there. And the next thing may have just made all that make sense. So that kind of threw me just a little bit there. Okay.
Okay. This is fiction. I arrive at Agran flight port somewhat later than planned on the morning of my departure for Beral. This trip has been a long time coming, prevented primarily by my lifelong fear of distance travel. Unfortunately, this will be no social visit. My sister Prema is in need of my assistance. I've always predicted her path would be one of struggle, as her tendency to take unreasonable risks and follow momentary appetites was certain to lead her astray. I cannot presume to know what trouble she has found or what dangers I may face in that great city. However, I am prepared to take any steps necessary to secure her safety. The flight port is not what I'd expected, nothing like the images I've seen of such places in Father's books. In my mind's eye, I had seen a large stone building backed by almost endless runways with bar dragons coming and going, delivering loads of passengers to their destinations. But Agran is no bustling city, and no bar dragons can be seen on the empty stretch of cleared land that must serve as the runway. I thank the driver and make my way to the terminal, an aging wood building hardly larger than my father's mill. An old man seated at the ticket window greets me with an efficiency that seems entirely unnecessary, seeing as I am the only person in the queue. The man looks up at me and down through squinted eyes. Name? I hesitate only a moment before answering truthfully. As much as I'd like to remain anonymous, there is always a chance that he could request to see my papers. Marine Denson, I say. Denson? He raises his eyebrows. Marine Denson? I tilt my head in acknowledgement. No, his answer is firm. You will not get on this flight.
Ross, do you want to start?
Yeah, you know, I wish I had more than a page because I'm still getting acclimated to this world, but I know it's not mine. The bar dragons at the flight port, this is clearly some kind of, I think it's some kind of fantasy world. And so I'm excited to learn a little more about where I am. My one suggestion for this piece moving forward might be that after the first sentence, I think the first and second paragraphs might be swapped, or maybe even that some of the details about the sister and her path of struggle, some of those might be better suited to waiting a few minutes so that we know where we are, so we start to get a sense of the world, its sights, its smells, and then we can sort of introduce the complication that the speaker is moving towards. I don't think you have to wait too long to do that, but I do think I'd like to know a little bit more about who is speaking and where in time and space they exist before we start focusing on another character.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. There's an awful lot here to admire. I mean, I do feel like I'm picking up on some of the sister and the dynamic there and the family dynamic, which I find interesting. I always love these relationship dynamics that we get to explore through characters. And then of course at the end with the no, I wasn't expecting that. Didn't see that one coming. So that meant I would have definitely turned the page to say, okay, where are we going with this? But I agree with Ross on everything. I want to offer this for whatever it's worth. I know that a lot of spec fiction uses that first person point of view. And I just want to say this, and some of you have been with me on some of my last Tuesday of the month sessions have heard me say this ad nauseum. And that's that one thing that I hear constantly from publishers is they do not want to see novel manuscripts that are debut novel manuscripts written in first person point of view. And the reason for that is because point of view, first person point of view is incredibly difficult to get right. Is so they, not saying that this isn't, but I'm just saying that I would really be hesitant about this if this is debut. I kept reading it myself in a third person point of view, and I could see how that would give a lot more latitude and a lot more room for things. And so I would just say, if the writer hasn't already played around with point of view, consider playing around with point of view. And the reason the publishers tell me or tell us that, and this was actually said in a North Carolina Writers Network fall conference, was that debut authors tend to write what they know. Even if they're going to write it as spec fiction, they tend to write what they know. And writing what you know is like writing a memoir. And if you know anything about writing a memoir, what makes it so difficult is because so much of the material is already known to you so well that you don't realize how much is not yet showing up on the page that needs to be expressed. You think it's all there, but it's not. And so then it has to go back and be pulled out and worked on and that sort of thing. So that's why publishers tell us, you know, please don't bring us these debut novels that are in first person point of view. We find that debut novelists do better in third person point of view. So I just offer that for whatever it's worth, because I felt like the point of view. The other thing too is that when we go into first person point of view, it's typically because there is something really unique about the way this person thinks, speaks, or sees the world. And that's what makes it so necessary to be in a first person point of view. And I didn't feel like I had that here yet. I feel like I have like the older sister who's very responsible. I don't have, it's not the catch-22 Colin Holdfield character that we get from page one, right? Where we know that has to be in a first person point of view because of how quirky he comes across in the first opening lines and how he sounds. So just kind of keep those things about point of view in mind. I'm just throwing them out there for whatever it's worth. It's nothing hard and fast other than what I'm told. And I couldn't understand for the longest time why none of my debut novel manuscripts I was representing were getting picked up by anybody. Nobody was picking them up. And then when they started moving them into third person point of view, I was a little more successful with them, because in third person, they could step out of their own, what do I know about this story? And they were able to actually fill in what was missing. Does that make sense at all? Anybody disagree? Want to shoot me? I'm on Zoom. Anything? Ross, anything you want to add or refute or anything about that?
No, I actually did not know that about debut novels. I'm so glad you shared that.
Yeah, my MFA students who write spec fiction at SNU, Southern New Hampshire, they do not like hearing me say that because spec fiction has a tendency to really hone in on that first person point of view. and fantasy. And so I'm like, okay, then you've got to nail it. You've got to get it right. There's got to be something unique about that person, that first person, that's going to pull us in, that's going to show us, you know, some interesting, new, quirky way they see the world or whatever. So sometimes they'll go back and play with it third, and then they figure out in third what they're missing for first. And then they can go back and play around with it. That makes sense. Okay.
Okay.
No questions. Go ahead, Stevie.
Okay. This is called Parsing Squirrel Life. Squirrels punctuate our yard, a squiggle of a comma as one hurries through the underbrush, an explosion of an asterisk as another plunges onto the deck, soon to become a question mark dangling from the bird feeder, seeking more, more, more. Another is a dash across the yard, a colon pausing, poised up a tree, a ripple of a cedilla sliding along a branch. From my kitchen window, I watch them scamper over our back deck until one day I see one sharpening its teeth on my kitchen window, its beady umlaut eyes meeting mine. I tap the window pane, it scampers off. Half a dozen live in the ancient oaks in our west yard, and fall is coming, acorns aplenty dropping for them to feast on and to hoard, dig holes to store them for the lean times in winter. Mother, grandmother, kits and sires, sometimes two face to face, tails bracketed like parentheses. Then two in breeding season, which seems to last year round. A healthy mama squirrel can produce 2-3 litters in a year. A mating pair runs up and around a big tree, the male in rapt pursuit, their ritual entangled as an ampersand. Promiscuously prolific, eternally alert, but in rare moments on a sunny day, utterly still, at peace and safe. Period.
I love that period. Ross, our poetry expert.
Well, I'm going to disagree. Actually, this poem had me until the period.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, it did. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Okay. I just want to say, I love the metaphor here. I love the idea that this poem is essentially seeing in squirrels the different marks of punctuation. I think the title maybe guides us to that a little bit much. It would have been more fun to discover that over time, but even so, a terrific metaphor, and it really gets at one of the things I love most about poetry, which is when poems make me see the world I know in an entirely new way, which this poem is doing all throughout. But at the end of a poem, when the poem puts too fine a bow tie on the end and just wraps everything up beautifully and cleanly, a lot of times what happens is it's either A, signaling its own self-satisfaction, which I don't think is actually what's happening here, but B, it's closing off possibilities for further contemplation. And I do think that's what's happening here. So many excellent poems open up to the wide world of possibilities and mysteries, and this one shuts it all down by ending with that period. Now, I do think that you can still pull off this stanza if there's something more. I also think you can end this on ampersand.
Yes.
That's an incredible image, but this current final stanza is not working well as a final stanza because it essentially says, I'm done. You don't have to think about this poem anymore. And this is a poem I found myself wanting to keep thinking about. It's such a great metaphor.
Oh my God, that's beautiful. I loved every bit of that explanation. And I think that because there was something in the final stanza that just didn't do anything for me, that I just went ahead and fell in love with, like, period, instead. But really the most beautiful ending would be the one in the stanza above it where they're ritual entangled as an ampersand, because that then allows us to continue to think about this and to envision and ruminate a little bit more. So yeah, that's very good points. Agree totally. When it started off with all of the the punctuation terms, I thought, oh God, this is fun. Here we go. This is going to be cool. And exactly as Ross said, showing us and showing us nature or something in a way we've never seen it before. We would have, most of us never put together two back-to-back squirrel tails as parentheses or something. It's very, very clever. Very well done. I didn't see anything really in that final stanza that I thought really needed to be there. So I think really going back and looking at that ampersand as an ending is really something to consider.
And now I'm gonna pick one nit because I just had a horrible realization, and that is that I think an umlaut as a diacritical is a mark of pronunciation, but not a mark of punctuation. And somebody would
It's
have
the mark over a vowel.
Yeah, it's a diacritical. So now I'm wondering. I'm like, uh-oh, are marks of pronunciation are they forms of punctuation? And I don't know. And I bet some stodgy grammarian somewhere would be like, oh no. So that's I bet the writer has looked that up already. And has
Well,
figured
what
it
about
out.
the cedilla, that goes under the letter C? Would that be the
Yeah,
same thing?
that same thing. But I'm going to trust the writer has figured that out, and that
Okay.
my grammar questions are dumb questions. So we'll move on.
No, but that's definitely worth bringing up because someone at a literary journal, if this writer wanted to turn that in, who is that stodgy grammarian and knows those little details, would go, well, you had me until you blew it at that. So yeah, be sure, writer, dear writer, be sure. Okay,
Okay.
Stevie.
This is the last one. It's a poem, Ritual of the Night. Come with me, he says. I do not know why. Share an adventure to supply support. I do not know why. He sniffs sultry air, ears up and tail stiff to supply support. He sniffs sultry air. Is there danger there? Ears up and tail stiff. Stars punch the dark sky. Is there danger near? He watches wary. Stars punch the dark sky. Trucks punch the quiet. He watches wary. Leaves crunch, and I see a shadow among shadows. I hear trucks passing. Leaves crunch, then I hear silence. The air is still. A shadow among shadows. His black shape appears. Silence. The air is still. Ready to go home. His black shape appears. Come with me, he says.
I just want to jump in and say this at first. Hearing this read aloud helped me more than just my reading it earlier. Ross, I don't know if you would agree, but I kept looking at this like, pantoum? It's not a villanelle. It didn't quite fit all the rules of a pantoum. So I was like confused. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's aiming towards Pantoum, but yeah, it slips a little bit in the later stanzas, and that's a place I would definitely look at. It seems as though maybe a line has stuck around in revision where its partner has been replaced. Um, and I think another thing to think about with the Pantoum is that classically, line 3 of the Pantoum becomes the anti-penultimate line in the final stanza. And so here we've got share an adventure and then ready to go home, which seem they seem opposed more than anything. But that being said, I love a good Pantoum, and I'm always sort of thrilled when I get into one. I did have some questions in terms of I've got a sense of what the action is. I've got a sense of what the mood and the tone are. But I wanted more of the concrete details in this. And specifically, I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about our furry friend who's beckoning our speaker in, and what our speaker's sort of perceived relationship to that furry friend would be. Because that seems to me like a piece of information that would give us some real clarity and might help us locate ourselves tonally. I gotta say, how many lines have I seen about stars in the night? I feel like I have seen about 1,000,000 of them, and still, I would kill to have written the line "Stars punch the dark sky." What an incredible verb to freshen up an image that we've all seen 1,000,000 times. Like, huge bravo to that. That was a moment where I was like, Heck yeah. And that's one thing I love about a good pantoum is that it because it has the onus of using each line twice, it has to find excitement, it has to have thrill in the language. And a sentence like that has thrill in the language. So I bravo there.
So let me ask you this question. Since it has its tendencies to fall into the formal style of pantoum, but it doesn't quite follow through the rest of the way, how would a poetry editor at a literary journal look at that?
That's a great question, and I think there's sort of two ways to do that. Sometimes you are in a formal poem, and you recognize that the form is starting to loosen or even fall apart because the content is requiring that of the poem. That what seemed to be a tightly controlled moment, the speakers losing their grip, or perhaps the poet sort of losing their grip on the subject matter. But we need to see in some ways justification for that slippage.
Right.
And in this poem, where danger is possible, but we don't necessarily have a bright line moment of disruption, I would say that that really sort of pulls me out, and I start wondering, oh, has the form proven to be too difficult to execute the poem? And so I'd be really wary as a poetry editor of that moment in the poem.
Yeah, I think if there had only been like one place or one little thing, that could be justified, but because it does slip several ways toward the second half, then I'm as a poetry editor, I would really be wondering why did it even have to start as a pantoum, for the first several stanzas, because you had me at that part and then it kind of falls apart. So but it definitely picks up that final last line is the first line of the poem. Come with me, he says. I mean, like I said, when I heard Stevie read it, I picked up on a lot more than I did even just reading it myself. But thanks for weighing that in, because I would assume that if you're going to work in a formal style, then you need to be aware of how a poetry editor is going to consider that work before they publish it.
Yeah. I think one other thing to notice is that the pronoun he is ascribed to the animal at first, it's ascribed to the dark shadow at the end. And I think that that's a moment of potential confusion for your reader to say, I think I've got what's going on, but there is another possible reading. And while I love poems that lend themselves to multiple interpretations and possibilities, when those are around, like who is speaking or what is happening in a poem, those are the less satisfying ones. When it asks us for multiple philosophical interpretations, that's when I think some complexity or ambiguity might be warranted. But we do, on narrative details, we want clarity.
Good point. So for a writer considering a pantoum, is there some material that just doesn't lend itself? I mean, where does one just suddenly decide I'm gonna play with a pantoum and come up with the first four lines and then go from there? I mean, are there some things that are just not conducive? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of the repetitive forms like Pantoum, Villanelle, and Sestina, because they're constantly enacting a form of stasis on the work, they're constantly enacting a pull back towards their source material. Um, they require a certain dynamism in the language in order to keep us feeling like the poem has propulsion that's working against that stasis. Now, is there a subject matter that's not suited to that? I think the minute anybody says this subject matter won't work in a pantoum, some smart poet's going to get out there and pull it off. So you will not catch me making that mistake. I think and that's the joy of poems, is that every time you set a rule, some brilliant poet comes along, breaks the rule, and does it beautifully, and you think, well, that rule was no good. So yeah, I'm up for any content in a pantoum as long as the intensity of language comes along with it.
Great. Thanks for explaining that. I was excited to find a Pantoum. I mean, I haven't read one of those since probably undergrad. So I was excited. I thought, wait a minute. I recognize this. I recognize this. Yeah, it's great. Okay. How about questions for the last couple of Stevie, by the way? Yay, Stevie.
Yeah.
Great job reading. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Do we have questions from anyone? Anything in the chat? Anybody place any questions there? I mean, anything. Yes, George.
So two things. One, by the way, in the chat for everybody is the information about Ross and Tracy and some other comments. So just if you want to get those or look at them before we close down. I don't know if you get them or not. I get them, but so you just know that that's information in there. And so Tracy, you talked about dialogues should do either advance the story or do something else. Is that what you said?
Reveal something about the character.
So
a lot of times it can be like the word choice of the character reveals something about the background of the character. So in other words, the diction that the character is using tells us a lot about that character right there. Well, we maybe make assumptions and maybe purposefully, the writer has that character using that particular word, that diction, because they want to ground us with that particular background, for example.
So I mean, I've done some interplay between characters that when they see each other each time the interplay happens with the intent that you get to see that interplay happens. But does that become, you shouldn't keep doing that? You know what I mean?
No, I'm not saying that. It's just, cut through all the stuff that we would typically do, like, hi, how are you? Get rid of all that stuff and just get right into the dialogue. There are ways that writers, novelists, and short story writers can really teach themselves how to write the most effective dialogue. And that's by studying screenwriting, screenplays. My favorite teacher of all is the guru of screenwriting, and that's Robert McKee. And I've had the fortune of attending several of his LA seminars. He goes through in his book, which is the Bible of screenwriting called Story, he goes through writing effective dialogue. And you can also catch him on a number of free YouTubes and all of that. But he goes into what actually makes for the most effective dialogue. And so people who are really good at dialogue, I mean, a lot of times you'll find that our crime writers are some of the best when it comes to writing dialogue because they get right to the heart. They know about how that line of dialogue has to be delivered and how it needs to be both character revealing and moving the narrative forward.
Okay.
And so sometimes it's a matter of, the person just is so blunt with how they ask every question, and then, and also it's about making sure that characters don't sound exactly the same, and that takes some skill to recognize that all of my characters are actually using the same type of diction, the same sentence structure. And so you have to go back and you have to adjust, and certain characters need to sound differently than others. And how you have them sound is actually revealing their background, sometimes their educational background, sometimes the region of the world or country that they live in because of the word choice. All of those are within the writer's control. They're all in your toolbox that you get to play with.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome, Penny. I saw that
So,
pop up. You're welcome.
From a
She said
recording
thanks to
point of
both.
view, we're good. I guess we can wrap up the recording, and so let me at least do that. With just thank everybody. What a great turnout today we had for the recording. We had 18. I think I had 20 at one point here. I
Oh
believe.
my goodness, it's great.
18 people today, so that's great. And,
Well, Ross, it was fun. You're gonna have to get your cowbell working though.
I'm so baffled as to how it's loud to me, and oh well.
so
That
we-
is
Next
Tracy.
time, kazoo.
That's
Tracy,
weird.
I'd
Yes.
like to ask one question about the book of the script writing. The title is Story, and who is the author?
Robert, it's on my desk, but I can't reach it. It's called Story, and then there's like a 50-word tagline after that. But it's Robert McKee, MCKEE. If you ever have a chance to, there are novelists that show up at his screenwriting seminars. I mean, they go all weekend, and it's just unbelievable. If you go with a work in progress in mind, and then hear him talk you through the whole dramatic structure of a screenplay, dialogue setting, everything, you will come out of there with so many revisions in your head for your novel that it'll be worth the price. I mean, it's amazing. Who's the director for Lord of the Rings? Who did that? Peter Jackson. He always goes. Every time he has a new script, he makes himself go to another Robert McKee seminar, even though he's probably attended like dozens of them already, because it just triggers all the holes that he's got in his current work in progress. And he can find them by listening to Robert go back through the fundamentals again. And then he goes home and he plugs in and he's good to go. One of the most profound things that Robert says has to do about endings. And I think I covered endings one last Tuesday craft seminar. But I've never forgotten what he said which about endings, give them the ending they want, just not the way they expect it. Which I think applies to all of our, short stories, novels, anything, well, especially if the work has a certain type of tropes attached to it, but give them the ending they want, just not the way they expect it. I think that's gold.